Our reading this morning comes from the 21st chapter of Genesis, verses 8 through 21. The setup for this is that Abraham and Sarai have lived into advanced age, and they have never had a child. And so Sarai says, well, here's Hagar, who is a servant of our household, our maid. Marry her, Abraham. Marry her and have a child with her, and then at least we will have a child in the family. And then later, Sarah herself becomes pregnant. And those two children are born together, and we find them playing together. Their mothers are not playing together. A rivalry is created between them. And we see here the outcome of that rivalry. The child, Isaac, grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, Ishmael, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on the count of his son Ishmael. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman." So God comes to Abraham, and he continues, "Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For it is through Isaac that the offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning. We hear those lines later when he rises with Isaac to go to the place of sacrifice. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar and put it on her shoulder along with the child and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite her child, she lifted up her voice and she wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness, and he became an expert with the bow. He had lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Amen. I remember when I was a child, I had a fear, and it was probably unfounded, that my nuclear family would all go our separate ways, that I would be one of those children walking down the road with a sack tied on a stick like David Copperfield. And you know, parents don't always get along. My parents are attached at the hip. It's a successful marriage that has lasted, I guess, 53 years. But they would still argue. Now, I remember one day they weren't getting along that well, and the day dragged on into night. It wasn't a terrible argument, but they weren't getting along. And every night, my father and I would go feed our horses. We had to drive out to a pasture to do that. And something in his voice that night he said, "All right, Charles, come on, we're going." And this alarmed me, and I put out of mind that we were going to feed the horses, and I said in a little voice, "Where are we going?" Because I figured that this was the end of the family, that I would go with my dad, and that my mother would stay at home. And this, it tickled him. I remember a smile creeping across his face. He was saying, "We're going to feed the horses. Where do you think we were going?" I said, "I don't know, feed the horses." But the fantasy continued. And I think that all of us somehow deep down live with this fear that this person that we're sitting beside in a pew, this person that we are going to today after church, these people that we count on, this community, they are going to go away and leave us alone. Not only go away, but reject us, exile us, push us away from them. This is what's being depicted in this story today. The fears of a family breaking apart coming true. Fears of outcastness, exile, leaving forever. And we have this father figure, Abraham. He doesn't help at all because he doesn't seem like much of a father figure in this moment. He's very passive. The women of the household are fighting, and he's afraid to say what he thinks. Or if he does, it doesn't seem to have much effect. The feminist reading of this is very complicated because he's caught between a rivalry between two wives in a patriarchal society, and where that power which he has assumed, perhaps unjustly, we know it's unjustly, but when it disappears, chaos erupts, civil war erupts. And so we see depicted the dangers of a household where the man is completely in charge and where there is no order that can exist beyond that unrighteous centralization. It is traditional to call this passivity, this radical obedience of Abraham, faith. Great is Abraham's faith, faithful Abraham. We use Abraham's name as a byword of faith. The Apostle Paul did, the Psalms do. Abraham's great faith. And yet, it's sometimes hard to see him that way. He seems rather to think that he just loves everybody, that everything will just work out, that God will take care of it, that God will take care of me. And so his faith here and earlier in Genesis, when he tries to pass off his wife as his sister, and later when he will lead his own son up on Mount Moriah to be sacrificed, this great faith of Abraham's can strike us as inhuman, overly obedient, under questioning. Because of this, the wonderful scholar Phyllis Tribble called this text a text of terror. She wrote a famous book 40 years ago entitled Text of Terror, in which scenes in Genesis and throughout the Bible were used to exemplify the ways that women were mistreated in the Bible, where their powerlessness was particularly expressed, and where great damage was done to people, families, communities because of this lopsided and terrifying power. She shows us that obedience to God can result in grave suffering and injustice to those who seem outside the plan, who seem disposable because of the plan. If you have an LGBTQ identity, If you are a person of color, maybe for other reasons, you know something about this terror. And we ask today, who in our plan is disposable? Because I think that all of us carry a vision of the way that we would like things to work out for us, for our community. And we tend to draw a circle. And there are people who are vital to the plan, who are helpful to the plan. And then there are those who oppose the plan or who are inessential to the plan. And those people can tend to be marginalized. In fact, they usually are. Who in our plan is disposable? In God's plan, we say that no one is disposable. And perhaps there is evidence of this because there is a turning point in the story and God shows up. God shows up. Hagar has run out of water. She lays her child under a bush, this child in whom she hopes under a bush, and she goes a little distance away. And she sits there in anguish, waiting for him to die. And before we extol the God of great faithfulness who will help us out of our troubles, let us first ask this question. Who is this God that allowed Hagar to reach such an extreme of suffering? This is a question that we have to live with. Who is this God who brings a mother to a point that she's placing her only child under a bush to die and is so anguished, so in despair that she herself cannot be with him at that time? Why would God try anyone in this way? Try Job in this way? Try Jeremiah, who we've just heard from, in this way? Why would God bring us to such extremes as this? And then the extreme is ended. And the messenger from God comes and shows them provisions. And somehow they are going to continue according to this messenger of God. And there's a promise that Ishmael will also, like Isaac, found a nation and be renowned forever and ever. This is a story about finally getting what you want. It's a story about a lot of things, but it's a story about finally getting what you want. And if we've worked really hard for a long time or waited a long time for something, if we felt like something was impossible and then suddenly by an act of grace it is given to us, the joy of it is absolutely, absolutely wonderful. It's like driving down the highway, waiting for that rest stop. Luke and I were driving through the mountains a few weeks ago, and we entered a patch of wilderness where there was not a rest stop, and well, both of us had to go. And when that sign finally appeared, rest stop in 30 miles, we looked at each other and we thought, can we make it? And then we did. We made it, and we dashed in. And fortunately, there wasn't a line in front of us. Because I wonder whether we would have acted like Christians in that time, or whether we would have elbowed people out of the way, or whether we would have just run off into the woods. Don't know. Don't know. Something else can happen when we get what we want. We start creating strong narratives about how we deserved it, about how God is only on our side there, about how we are the victors, about how God put that rest stop there just for me. Because our suffering has hurt us and has given us a feeling of resentment. And when we finally get what we want, we tend to vault. We tend to say, finally, victory is delivered, and we re-narrate. We forget that maybe we were complicit in our own suffering. We forget that our enemies are people too. And we cheer for ourselves against those who are suddenly, in a crystalline way, responsible completely for our suffering. We see this happening with Sarai, who will become Sarah. Hagar crystallizes as the threat and the enemy. What I want to do to finish this sermon is to imagine that while all of this is happening out there in the wilderness, Hagar, speaking to a messenger of God, scooping up her child again, being provided water and food and a future, that while all of this is happening, Abraham's household also continues. They're at home, under their tents. They're cooking a hot meal. There's plenty of water. There are servants. And there is an attempt, I think, to express satisfaction. There's an attempt to say that this is good, that this is the way it was supposed to be. Now, finally, Sarai and Abraham and Isaac are the family, the chosen ones, the future of greatness. However, what remains? Who was the sacrifice? And how do they cope with that? Abraham is a person who has one thing and then another and then another and then another laid upon his conscience. He's a person who makes difficult, sacrificial decision one after another for the sake of survival and because he's a quiet and passive person. And now he has to live with it. And the question is, how to apologize, how to come right with God for the things, the choices that were put in his way that seemed unavoidable and yet may have been avoidable, that were a function of his personality, that were a function of the society that he lived in. How to change that. Until we get to the prophets, the Bible is fairly quiet on that. In the tales of the patriarchs, things simply seem to happen. And the patriarchs can seem very low on choice. But Israel read these stories. Israel read these stories and said, no, never again will we cast our children into the wilderness to starve to death. Never again will we allow household dissension to tear us apart and to create exceptional good for some and exceptional bad for others. Never again will we behave in such unjust ways. This tale places great responsibility on us, a tale and a responsibility that never end, because we all live out the story of Hagar and of Sarai and of Abraham. And it tells us that yes, God provides for us, but first of all, God calls on us, expects us to provide for one another. And our text today, which depicts a tragic compromise and a victory of one over the other who receives a consolation prize, they may be in their way fairy tales, but they are also our realities. And so today, let's live as God would have us live, and let us take responsibility for this tale. In the name of the one who was and who is to come. Amen.